says, quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." So it marked the first major expansion of the right of suffrage, theoretically. It expanded this to African Americans. But again, remember, not all African Americans, specifically African American women still couldn't vote because women were not allowed the right to vote. So even though the 15th Amendment is passed, women are still not allowed to vote. But even though it's passed, the 15th Amendment, and it theoretically gives African Americans the right to vote, what we see is again states intervene, and in particular the southern states, and their response to the 15th Amendment is what we refer to as the Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws. So let me explain some of the things that the states passed to try and thwart African American voting. First of all, some states passed what were referred to as grandfather clauses. So what the grandfather clause said was that you couldn't vote if your grandfather hadn't voted. So what was the chance as a newly freed slave that your grandfather had voted? Not very good. As a matter of fact, it's 0. Secondly, many states passed literacy tests. So they said, okay, before we're going to let you vote, you have to pass a citizenship literacy test. And they were usually verbal. And they would go something like this. If you were a white male voter, they would ask you, the highest law of the land is what? The U.S. Constitution. Very good. You can vote. You're brilliant. If you're an African American voter, they would ask you a question like, can you please tell us what the 10th Amendment is and how it applies to our society? Oh, you don't know? Well, you're obviously not literate, and we were not going to let you vote. In addition to that, they passed poll taxes. So for example, in Georgia in 1877, they put a tax of $1 or $2 on every citizen who wanted to vote. And it was cumulative. So in other words, if you were a newly freed slave and you were in your 40s or 50s, so you hadn't voted for 20 years, you'd have to pay $20. And a newly freed slave did not have those kinds of resources. And then some states passed what were referred to as white-only primaries. So they were very blatant about it. They said, in our primaries, our nomination systems, only white people can vote. And the courts at the time upheld most of these things when they were first enacted. So if you look at African Americans, they really didn't receive the same right to vote until about 1964. And we'll talk about that when we get to contemporary suffrage issues. Well, the next major period in regard to suffrage is 1920. And 1920 gave us a major extension of suffrage because it marked the passage of the 19th Amendment, which ratified on August 18th, 1920. And it gave us the most dramatic increase in the number of voters in our history. Until 1869, women could not vote anywhere in the world. So again, the United States was no exception. So women in the United States start demanding the vote, and women's suffrage movements from 1850s on. And actually, in 1869, Wyoming became the first state to grant women the right to vote. But it wasn't until 1893 that another state followed, and that was Colorado. But with the passage of the 19th Amendment, women gained the universal right to vote throughout the United States. They could not be denied the right to vote based upon their gender. The fourth major error in regard to suffrage is what we refer to as post-World War II. Post-World War II. And post-World War II is an era during which there are a number of actions that are taken in the United States to expand suffrage. Some of them were legislative, some of them were judicial decisions, and some of them were constitutional. So, for example, in 1994, the United States Supreme Court finally ruled that white primaries were unconstitutional. So it took 70 years, but they finally came to that conclusion. In 1966, the United States Supreme Court held for the first time that state poll taxes were unconstitutional. And then the United States Congress in the 60s passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And these laws were enacted to ensure the rights of African Americans in many areas, but specifically in the area of voting, and to curtail discrimination and its practices on Election Day. 16 states, mostly Southern, that historically had discriminated against minorities in regard to votes, were required to pre-clear changes in any election rule with federal authorities to ensure that this rule did not have the purpose or effect of denying the right to vote on account of race or color. And within this context, and as a result of the Voting Rights Act, the federal government, till this day, actually sends officials to monitor elections all over the country. And then we have a constitutional amendment, the 24th Amendment. And the 24th Amendment, passed in 1964, outlawed the poll tax. So there's significant change during this era, which brings us to the more contemporary era from 1970s till now. And in 1971, we passed the 26th Amendment. And the 26th Amendment probably has a lot of significance for many of you, students. What it did is it said the right of the citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state. In other words, it made a national uniform voting age of 18 years of age. because many states had voting requirements that were older than 18, with the most common being 21. So what we see is that when you look at the history of suffrage in the United States, we go from an era where very few people were allowed to vote and actually voted, only 11% of the population at the beginning, where now, today, almost every group is allowed to vote. But there are still some limitations. Obviously, if you're less than 18 years of age, you can't vote. But there are some restrictions. So one of the restrictions, and it depends upon the state, is on convicted felons. Convicted felons. In all but 2 states, prison inmates can't vote. Now, in Maine and Vermont, you're still allowed to vote, even if you're a prison inmate. But then the question is, okay, so let's assume you're a prison inmate, you've been convicted of a felony, you serve your time, you get out of prison. What's your status in regard to voting? What's your status? Well, it varies, again, from state to state. In a large number of states, felons can vote after they serve their entire sentence. Florida, as an example, is a state that just recently changed this. So it used to be in Florida that if you were a felon, you were never allowed to vote again. But they just changed that in Florida to say that once you serve your time, you gain your right to vote back. You paid your debt to society. Now that was a very controversial bill in Florida, and we found a very different divide here, where Republicans opposed it and Democrats supported it. Now why? Some of the cynics say, well, that's because a disproportionate amount of the felons were minorities, and minorities tend to vote Democrat, so that's why the big division. So that's where we are today. The great majority of Americans are allowed the right to vote. Now when we look at that, we then want to ask, well, who actually does vote? So we have the right to vote, but what we see is voter turnout in the United States is a very interesting phenomenon. So for example, in 1992, it was the first time in American history that over 100 million people voted, which was a turnout of only 55% of eligible voters. In 1996, again a presidential year, only 49% of voters actually turned out. 49%, less than a majority. And that was the lowest turnout in over 70 years. So what we're saying here is, it's one thing to say who can vote, but it's another thing to determine who actually does vote. Now in 2008, Obama's first election, we had the highest turnout in 44 years, and that was 62%. 62%. Now, when we compare our voting turnout to other countries, what we see is that our numbers are pretty low. So if you look at your book, and I think it's on page 81. Nope, sorry. $179. It's on page 179. You could see that the United States voting turnout is lower than most European democracies, lower than Belgium, lower than Denmark, lower than Sweden, lower than Norway, lower than Italy, Australia, Netherlands, Spain, Israel, Germany, Ireland, so forth and so on, United Kingdom, France. So the question is why? Why is it so low? And part of the reason is the laws that these countries have in regard to voting. So in a lot of these countries, there's a national system for automatic registration. We don't have that in the United States. The day of the election, in many of these countries, voting occurs on a weekend. And as we know in the United States, it's on a Tuesday. In many of these countries, the government has an obligation, a legal obligation, to register voters. In the United States, there is no legal obligation. So what we see is that there are tremendous disparities in regard to voting. Now, when we look at voter turnout, I said before that there are significant differences by different demographics. So I want to give you an example of that. And let's look at things like race, gender, age, and education. So what we see is while the average voter turnout for the last 4 presidential elections has been about 60%, when we look at it by race, what we see is the average turnout for white voters is 64%. The average turnout for African American voters is 66%. For Hispanic voters, it drops to 48% of the vote. And for Asian voters, 47% of the vote. In regard to gender, males, 59% of them vote. Females, 64%, so women have better turnout than men. In regard to age, this is one that I talked about before, and now I want to give you the statistics. For voters 65 years and older, 74% of them vote. For the youngest voters, 18 to 25, 41%. 41%. 30 percentage points less than senior voters. And the same kinds of things based upon education. So what we see is for those who have high school or less, the average voter turnout is 30%. Those who are college graduates, 72%. So these things have a major impact on turnout. And I guess within this context, I want to urge all of you to vote in November. Voting is what our democracy is about. It's your obligation, your responsibility to our government and our country. So please, in November, and I don't care how you vote, but please vote. All right. So that's all about suffrage and who can vote. Next, we want to talk about how people vote in types of elections.